My name is Francesca Fiori, and I'm an associate lecturer at the University of St. Andrews and a former member of the Understanding Inequalities team. I am a demographer by background, and my research has explored the intersection between social inequalities and demographic diversity early in life, and how these impact on child outcomes later on. Today, I'm here to present some empirical research on social disparities in the experience of residential mobility in early childhood and children outcomes. First of all, what's so interesting about residential mobility and children? Well, to start, life course research has shown that individuals tend to be more mobile when they have young children. And this is because of the desire to move to better and larger housing, but also as a response to family or employment transition that tend to occur around the same period. Then, ecological perspectives of human development have emphasized the importance of multiple social contexts, family, peers, school, neighborhood, for children development, and view the residential move as a disruptive event that can trigger or result from other changes in children's lives. As a matter of fact, a large body of research has shown that children who stay in the same home tend to have better behavioral and emotional health and educational achievement than their more mobile counterparts. However, much of this research has compared the experience of movers versus the experience of non-movers. But more recently, the emphasis has shifted to the need for more nuanced approaches, which takes into account, for instance, the frequency and the timing of the move, the reason for moving, interactions with other life contexts. With this paper, I explore a further specific aspect, which is the nexus between social disparities and residential mobility. And this follows from ideas that not all moves are equal and not all families are equal. So whereas more advantaged families will often make intentional moves to better housing or moves to gain access to better local services, more disadvantaged families are more at risk of unplanned moves and of a deterioration of their life context. Further, families might also differ in the social, financial, and emotional resources they have to cope with the stress associated with a move and with the repercussion a move can have on their children. I use data from Growing Up in Scotland, which is a longitudinal study which follows the life of a cohort of children born in Scotland in the early 2000s. The study collects information on residential moves between each sweeps and measures children cognitive and non-cognitive outcome. For this particular piece of research, I focus on early childhood and observe the moves experienced from 10 months to age 5, and then children's cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes measured at age 5. Early childhood is a period characterized by high frequency of residential moves, as I said before. Over 40% of children in Scotland move before age 5, and the proportion are higher in the first 2-3 years, and the main reasons for families with children this age to move are housing or neighborhood improvements. Second key descriptive finding is that the existence of a clear social gradient in mobility patterns. So children from more advantaged family background, here measured with parental education, are less likely to move home in early childhood. On the other hand, children from less advantaged background are more likely to move, and I should add, to make more frequent moves, so more than 2 or 3 moves in those 5 years. Thirdly, whereas moves to improve housing or local areas conditions, which constitutes the majority of the moves, are not really socially patterned, on the other hand, there are stark social disparities and disparities that goes in an opposite direction among movers for education and movers for negative reasons, where for negative reason I intend moves following union dissolution, following unemployment or inability to pay the rent or the mortgage, or moves following evictions. So my focus with this research is on children outcomes measured at age 5. I studied both cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes. I use a measure of the ability of children to name objects of daily use to assess their cognitive development. And then I use a battery of indicators from Goodman's Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire to assess children's socio-emotional well-being with respect separately to internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Based on previous findings, I expect a negative relationship between residential mobility and children's outcomes. My first research question explores to what extent this is a consequence of selection effects. In other words, do mobile children fare worse simply because it is more disadvantaged families that are more likely to move? This graph shows the coefficient from my OLS regressions. As expected, the relationship between residential mobility and all 3 different outcomes is negative. But what happens when we include control for a number of socioeconomic characteristics of their parents and of their residential context? Does this explain away all the effect? Well, the answer is yes and no. So after controlling for parental education, parental social class, household income, and measures of housing and area deprivation, yes, the effects are reduced, and they're half the size as compared to what we observed before controlling. But nevertheless, they are still there, they're still significant for both the cognitive outcome and externalizing behaviors. So far I assumed that these effects were the same for everybody, but a second hypothesis is that some children might suffer more than others. Therefore, I carried out another series of models, including interaction terms between the move and each of the socioeconomic characteristics. So this interaction model do not show any interesting pattern with respect to parental socioeconomic characteristics. However, mobility does interact with the characteristics of the residential context, and it does so in 2 very different ways. So first, we observe that moving is particularly detrimental for children moving from private rented accommodation. Second, we observe that moving does not have a negative effect for children moving from the most deprived areas. To conclude, this research has confirmed the existence of a negative association between moving in early childhood and children's outcome measured at age 5. Part of this effect is explained by the fact that high residential mobility intersects with other dimensions of disadvantage. Nevertheless, some negative effects of the move itself still remain. The implication of residential mobility might depend on the child's social background. For some disadvantaged children, moving acts as an improvement of their circumstances. As an example, for those moving from the most deprived areas. For other children, moving exacerbates existing disadvantage, as is the case for those moving from private rented accommodation. So it is clear that the greater insecurity of tenure and the poorer quality of housing experienced by a growing number of children living within the private rented sector seems to compound the negative effects of residential mobility itself. And this has important policy implication and should be the focus of attention for policymakers. Thank you for your attention.